Master Chen Wei stood quietly in the corner of the Grand Palace courtyard, watching the morning training session with careful eyes. The 50-year-old martial arts instructor had spent the last 3 decades perfecting his craft, teaching students across 7 different countries. His weathered hands bore the scars of countless training sessions, and his calm demeanor reflected years of discipline and wisdom. The royal palace of Zhengzhou had invited him to observe their elite guard training program. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were hand-picked warriors who protected the most important officials in the region. Each guard had undergone years of rigorous training in combat, weapons handling, and tactical warfare. Their reputation was legendary throughout the province. As Chen Wei watched, he noticed something troubling. The guards moved with arrogance rather than precision. Their techniques were flashy but lacked fundamental principles. They relied heavily on brute strength rather than proper form and balance. The lead instructor, Captain Liu, was demonstrating a complex sword technique to a group of younger guards. His movements were impressive to the untrained eye, but Chen Wei could see multiple flaws in his stance and timing. The courtyard was filled with spectators, palace officials, visiting dignitaries, and local martial arts enthusiasts who had come to witness the famous royal guard training. Everyone seemed impressed by the elaborate display of kicks, punches, and weapon work. The crowd whispered among themselves, pointing at particularly dramatic moves and expressing their amazement. Chen Wei had seen this before in his travels. Many military organizations focused more on appearance than substance. They wanted techniques that looked intimidating, rather than methods that were truly effective. This approach might work for ceremonies and demonstrations, but it would fail in real combat situations where lives depended on proper execution. Captain Liu finished his demonstration and noticed the quiet observer in the corner. He had heard that a famous martial arts master was visiting the palace, but he hadn't paid much attention to the modest-looking man in simple clothing. Liu was proud of his position and confident in his abilities. He had defeated many challengers over the years and had earned his rank through what he believed was superior skill. The captain approached Chen Wei with a swagger in his step. Several guards followed behind him, curious about this interaction. The crowd began to take notice as well, sensing that something interesting was about to happen. Liu stood directly in front of Chen Wei, his chest puffed out and his voice carrying across the courtyard. "So you're the famous Master Chen we've heard about," Liu said with a smirk. "I've been watching you observe our training. You don't look very impressed. Perhaps you think you could do better than our royal guards." The challenge in his voice was unmistakable, and murmurs rippled through the gathered crowd. Chen Wei remained perfectly still, his expression unchanged. He had encountered this type of confrontation many times before. Young fighters, especially those in positions of authority, often felt the need to prove themselves when a respected master was present. It was human nature, but it usually led to embarrassment for the challenger. "I am simply here to observe and learn," Chen Wei replied in a soft but clear voice. "Your guards show great enthusiasm in their training." His diplomatic response only seemed to frustrate Captain Liu further. The crowd pressed closer, sensing drama in the air. Liu's face reddened slightly. He wasn't used to being dismissed so politely, and he interpreted Chen Wei's calm response as condescension. "Enthusiasm isn't enough in real combat, old man. Our techniques have been tested in actual battles. We protect the highest officials in this region. What have you done lately besides teach children in village schools?" The insult hung in the air like a challenge thrown down before medieval knights. Everyone in the courtyard went silent, waiting to see how the elderly martial arts master would respond to such disrespect. Some spectators looked uncomfortable, while others leaned forward with anticipation. This was exactly the kind of confrontation that would be talked about for years to come. Chen Wei's students, who had accompanied him to the palace, watched nervously from across the courtyard. They knew their master's capabilities, but they also knew his preference for avoiding unnecessary conflicts. However, they could see that this situation was quickly escalating beyond a simple misunderstanding. The royal guards were now gathering around their captain, showing their solidarity and making the challenge even more public and unavoidable. The tension in the courtyard grew thicker as Captain Liu waited for a response that never came. Chen Wei simply nodded respectfully and began to turn away, which only made the captain more determined to force a confrontation. The crowd watched in fascination as this psychological battle unfolded between the boastful guard captain and the serene martial arts master. Running away already? Liu called out loudly, making sure everyone could hear. I suppose all those stories about your legendary skills were just village gossip. Real warriors don't back down from honest challenges. His voice carried a mocking tone that made several spectators uncomfortable, but others began to whisper excitedly about the brewing confrontation. Chen Wei paused but didn't turn around. He had spent decades learning to control his emotions and his ego. True martial arts mastery wasn't about proving oneself to every challenger who appeared. However, he also understood that sometimes a demonstration was necessary to prevent future problems or to teach important lessons. The young guards watching this exchange would remember what happened here for the rest of their lives. One of Chen Wei's students, a young woman named Li Mei, stepped forward from the crowd. She couldn't remain silent while her respected teacher was being insulted so publicly. Master Chen has trained with the Shaolin monks and has taught martial arts in 12 countries, she said firmly. He has nothing to prove to anyone here. Captain Liu laughed loudly at this defense. Shaolin monks sitting in temples all day, meditating and eating vegetables. That's not real fighting. We guard against assassins, bandits, and enemy soldiers. We deal with life and death situations every single day. His guards nodded in agreement, their confidence boosted by their leader's bold words. The crowd was now completely focused on this drama. Palace officials had stopped their conversations to watch. Visiting dignitaries pulled out their phones to record what might become a legendary confrontation. Everyone sensed that something significant was about to happen, though no one could predict exactly what form it would take. Chen Wei finally turned around slowly, his movements fluid and controlled. His eyes met Captain Liu's gaze directly, and for the first time the captain felt a slight chill run down his spine. There was something unsettling about the master's complete calmness in the face of such public provocation. "Young captain," Chen Wei said in his quiet but carrying voice, "martial arts is not about proving who is strongest or most skilled. It is about discipline, respect, and understanding. True strength comes from knowing when to fight and when to show restraint." His words were measured and thoughtful, which somehow made them more impactful than if he had shouted or become angry. Liu scoffed at this philosophical response. "Pretty words don't stop bullets or blades, old man. In the real world, either you can fight or you can't, either you win or you lose. Everything else is just fancy talk for people who've never been in actual combat." He gestured toward his guards, who murmured their agreement with their captain's practical worldview. The master nodded thoughtfully, as if seriously considering the captain's perspective. "You raise interesting points about real combat. Perhaps you would be willing to demonstrate some of these battle-tested techniques you mentioned. I am always eager to learn from experienced warriors like yourself." His tone remained respectful, but several people in the crowd detected a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Captain Liu's chest swelled with pride at this apparent acknowledgement of his expertise. Finally, the famous master was showing proper respect for a real fighter. "Of course, I can show you proper combat techniques. What would you like to see? Sword work? Hand-to-hand combat? Defensive maneuvers?" He was already visualizing how impressive his demonstration would be in front of such a distinguished audience. Perhaps a simple display of balance and control would be sufficient, Chen Wei suggested mildly. Something that showcases the stability and precision that real combat requires. He gestured toward a nearby wooden training post that stood about chest high. "Could you demonstrate your striking technique on that target while maintaining perfect form?" Liu grinned confidently. This would be easy to show off with. He had broken dozens of similar posts during his training over the years. He walked over to the wooden target, rolled his shoulders to loosen up, and took his fighting stance. The crowd gathered closer in a circle around him, phones and cameras ready to capture his impressive display of power and skill. Captain Liu positioned himself in front of the wooden training post with theatrical precision. He wanted everyone to see his perfect fighting stance and appreciate the power he was about to demonstrate. His feet were planted wide, his muscles tensed, and his fist cocked back ready to deliver what he expected would be a devastating blow that would impress the entire crowd. The spectators held their breath in anticipation. Some had pulled out their phones to record what they expected would be an impressive display of the Royal Guard's training and power. Palace officials leaned forward with interest, while Chen Wei's students watched nervously, unsure of what their master was planning but trusting his wisdom completely. With a loud shout meant to intimidate and focus his energy, Captain Liu threw his most powerful punch directly at the center of the wooden post. His technique looked impressive to most observers. His form appeared solid, his speed was respectable, and the impact made a satisfying thud that echoed across the courtyard. The post vibrated from the force of the blow, and Liu stepped back with a satisfied grin on his face. "There," he announced proudly, flexing his slightly reddened knuckles. "That's how real combat power looks. Not fancy dance moves or meditation exercises, but actual force that can stop an attacker in his tracks." His guards applauded enthusiastically, and several spectators nodded appreciatively at the display of raw strength. Chen Wei walked slowly over to examine the wooden post, running his fingers gently along the surface where Liu had struck. He nodded thoughtfully as if studying the results with scientific curiosity. The crowd watched his every movement, trying to read his expression and guess what he might be thinking about the captain's demonstration. "Impressive force," Chen Wei acknowledged quietly. "You clearly have developed significant physical strength through your training." He paused, continuing to examine the post from different angles. "May I ask how long you have been practicing that particular striking technique?" Captain Liu puffed up with pride at what he interpreted as praise from the master. "I've been perfecting my combat strikes for over 15 years. Every technique I use has been tested in real situations against actual opponents. That's the difference between theoretical martial arts and practical fighting skills." The master nodded respectfully, then asked, "Would it be acceptable if I attempted a similar demonstration? I am curious to compare different approaches to the same basic technique." His request was phrased so politely that Liu couldn't refuse without appearing petty or afraid of comparison. "Of course," Liu replied magnanimously, stepping back to give the older man room. "Though I should warn you that this particular post is quite solid. It takes considerable force to make any real impact on it. Don't hurt yourself trying to match what younger fighters can do." Chen Wei smiled gently at the condescending warning and moved into position near the training post. Unlike Captain Liu's wide, aggressive stance, the master stood quite casually, almost as if he were simply having a conversation with a friend. His feet were close together, his body relaxed, and his breathing remained calm and steady. The crowd murmured with curiosity and some skepticism. This didn't look like any fighting stance they had ever seen before. Some spectators wondered if the elderly master was about to embarrass himself by attempting something beyond his physical capabilities. Even some of Chen Wei's own students looked concerned about what their teacher was planning. Without any dramatic preparation or loud shouting, Chen Wei simply extended his arm toward the wooden post. His movement was so smooth and natural that it almost looked like he was reaching out to shake someone's hand. There was no visible tension in his muscles, no winding up for a powerful strike, no dramatic martial arts poses that spectators expected to see. His palm touched the wooden post so gently that several people in the crowd couldn't even tell if he had made contact. It looked more like he was testing the temperature of the wood, rather than attempting to strike it with any kind of force. The entire interaction lasted less than 2 seconds, and then Chen Wei stepped back with the same calm expression he had worn throughout the entire confrontation. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Captain Liu looked confused, wondering if the old man had simply given up or forgotten what he was supposed to be demonstrating. Several spectators exchanged puzzled glances, not understanding what they had just witnessed. The wooden post stood exactly where it had been before, showing no visible signs of impact or damage. Then, with a sharp crack that made everyone jump, a perfectly straight line appeared down the entire length of the wooden training post. The crack spread from top to bottom in less than a second, and then the post split cleanly into 2 equal halves, falling to either side with a solid thud that resonated across the suddenly silent courtyard. The silence in the courtyard was deafening. Every person present stared at the 2 perfectly split halves of the wooden training post, trying to process what they had just witnessed. The cut was so clean and precise that it looked like it had been made with a laser, rather than human contact. No one had seen or heard any impact that could have caused such complete destruction. Captain Liu's mouth fell open as he stared at the split wood. His confident expression melted away, replaced by confusion and growing disbelief. He had put everything he had into his punch and had only managed to make the post vibrate slightly. This elderly man had barely seemed to touch the wood, yet had somehow split it completely in half with what appeared to be no effort at all. Several spectators began whispering frantically among themselves, comparing what they had recorded on their phones and trying to make sense of what they had seen. Some replayed their videos in slow motion, but even with careful examination, they couldn't detect the moment when the destructive force had been applied to the wooden post. Chen Wei stood quietly beside the split training post, his expression unchanged from the beginning of this entire encounter. He showed no pride, no satisfaction, and no desire to gloat over his demonstration. If anything, he looked slightly sad, as if he regretted that the situation had escalated to the point where such a display had become necessary. How was that possible? One of the younger guards whispered to his companion, unable to keep his voice completely quiet. That post was solid hardwood. It would take an axe or saw to cut through it that cleanly. What kind of technique was that? Palace officials began murmuring among themselves, trying to understand the implications of what they had witnessed. Several visiting dignitaries were frantically sending messages on their phones, describing the incredible demonstration to colleagues who hadn't been present. The atmosphere in the courtyard had shifted completely from skeptical amusement to awed respect. Li Mei, Chen Wei's student, felt a surge of pride mixed with concern for her teacher. She knew that he preferred to avoid such dramatic displays, but she also understood that sometimes extraordinary circumstances required extraordinary responses. The disrespectful treatment he had received from Captain Liu had forced him to demonstrate capabilities that he normally kept hidden. Captain Liu finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak than his earlier confident tone. What kind of martial art was that? I've never seen anything like it in all my years of training and combat experience. His arrogance had completely disappeared, replaced by genuine confusion and growing respect. Chen Wei turned to face the captain, his expression remaining gentle and patient. It is called internal energy cultivation, combined with precise technique and many years of practice. The goal is not to create impressive displays, but to develop complete control over one's physical and mental abilities. True power comes from understanding, not from force. The master gestured toward the split wooden post without looking at it. This demonstration teaches us that sometimes the most effective techniques are also the most subtle ones. In real combat, efficiency and precision are far more valuable than dramatic movements or brute strength. An opponent who cannot see your technique coming cannot defend against it effectively. Several guards nodded slowly, beginning to understand that their previous assumptions about martial arts effectiveness had been completely wrong. They had been taught to value power and intimidation over subtlety and control. This demonstration was forcing them to reconsider everything they thought they knew about combat and self-defense. Captain Liu looked down at his reddened knuckles where he had struck the post with all his strength, then back at Chen Wei's unmarked hands. The contrast was impossible to ignore. "Master Chen," he said quietly, his voice now carrying genuine respect instead of mockery, "I owe you an apology for my earlier behavior and words. I was wrong to question your abilities or your teachings." The crowd remained silent, waiting to see how the martial arts master would respond to this public acknowledgement of error. Many conflicts in their experience had led to further escalation rather than resolution. They were curious to see whether Chen Wei would accept the apology graciously or use this opportunity to further demonstrate his superiority over the humbled guard captain. Chen Wei smiled, warmly for the first time since this entire confrontation had begun. "Captain Liu, your strength and dedication to protecting others are admirable qualities. Every martial artist continues learning throughout their entire life. Today we have both learned something valuable about different approaches to the same goals." His gracious response surprised many spectators who had expected him to be less forgiving. The master walked over to one of the split halves of the wooden post and picked it up, examining the clean-cut surface with apparent interest. This wood served its purpose well by helping us understand these principles. Perhaps it can continue to be useful for training, even in its current condition. His practical observation helped ease some of the tension that had built up in the courtyard. Word of the extraordinary demonstration spread through the palace like wildfire. Within hours, everyone from kitchen staff to high-ranking officials had heard about the martial arts master, who had split a wooden training post with what appeared to be the gentlest touch. The story grew with each telling, but even the most conservative accounts were difficult for people to believe. Captain Liu spent the rest of that day in deep contemplation, replaying the events over and over in his mind. His entire understanding of martial arts and combat effectiveness had been challenged in the space of a few minutes. That evening he approached Chen Wei privately, away from the crowds and spectators who continued to gather hoping to witness another demonstration. "Master Chen," Liu began hesitantly, "I've been thinking about what happened today, and I realize I don't understand anything about what you did. Would you be willing to explain how such a technique is possible? I've trained for 15 years, but I've never encountered anything like what you demonstrated." Chen Wei was sitting peacefully in the palace garden, enjoying the quiet evening air after the dramatic events of the day. He looked up at the captain with kind eyes, recognizing the genuine curiosity and humility in the younger man's voice. This was exactly the kind of teachable moment that made confrontations like today's occasionally worthwhile. The technique you witnessed today is the result of understanding how energy moves through the human body and into external objects, Chen Wei explained patiently. Most people think of martial arts as applying force against resistance, but there are ways to work with natural forces instead of against them, to find the weak points in any structure and apply pressure in exactly the right way. The master picked up a small stone from the garden path and held it in his palm. This rock seems solid and unchanging, but it has natural stress points and grain patterns that determine how it will break if the right pressure is applied in the right location. The wooden post was the same way. I wasn't using more force than you did. I was using force more precisely. Captain Liu listened intently, trying to understand concepts that were completely foreign to his military training background. But how do you learn to see these weak points? How do you develop that kind of precision? It seems almost supernatural to someone who has never seen it before. Chen Wei smiled at the captain's honest curiosity. There is nothing supernatural about it, though it may appear that way to people unfamiliar with these principles. It requires years of patient practice, careful observation, and constant refinement of technique. Most importantly, it requires learning to control your own emotions and ego, which often interfere with clear thinking and precise action. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of several palace officials who had been searching for Chen Wei throughout the evening. They approached respectfully, clearly having heard about the day's events and wanting to discuss something important with the master. "Master Chen," the lead official began formally, "we have received word that news of today's demonstration has reached very high levels of government. There is interest in having you provide training consultation for our national security forces. Would you be willing to discuss such an arrangement?" Chen Wei listened politely but showed no signs of excitement at this prestigious opportunity. "I appreciate the honor of such a request, but my teaching methods require students who are genuinely committed to learning, not just interested in dramatic techniques. True martial arts mastery cannot be rushed or simplified for mass training programs." The official nodded respectfully, though he seemed disappointed by the master's lack of enthusiasm. "Perhaps we could arrange for a smaller, more intensive program for selected individuals? The government would be very generous in compensation for your expertise and time." Captain Liu watched this exchange with growing understanding of Chen Wei's character. The master was being offered what was essentially a blank check by the government, along with tremendous prestige and recognition, yet he showed no interest in personal gain or fame. His priorities were clearly focused on genuine teaching and learning, rather than material rewards. "I will consider any proposal that focuses on proper education rather than quick results," Chen Wei replied diplomatically. "However, I must return to my own students and responsibilities soon." Perhaps Captain Liu could evaluate whether such a program would be beneficial for his guards and provide his honest assessment. The suggestion surprised Liu, who hadn't expected to be included in such high-level discussions. But he realized that Chen Wei was giving him an opportunity to be involved in something that could significantly improve the training and effectiveness of the royal guards under his command. After the officials departed to draft their formal proposal, Captain Liu remained in the garden with Chen Wei. "Master, why did you include me in those discussions? After my behavior today, I wouldn't blame you for wanting nothing to do with me or my guards." Chen Wei looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Leadership requires the ability to recognize potential in others, even when they haven't yet recognized it in themselves. Your willingness to apologize and learn shows more character than your initial arrogance revealed. Those are the qualities that make someone worth teaching. 3 months later, The Royal Palace training courtyard looked completely different from the scene of that memorable confrontation, where once there had been flashy demonstrations focused on impressing spectators. Now there were quiet groups of guards practicing subtle movements with intense concentration. The split wooden training post had been preserved as a reminder of the lesson learned that day. Captain Liu had become one of Chen Wei's most dedicated students. Despite the master having returned to his home province weeks earlier, the captain maintained regular contact through video calls and written correspondence, sharing his progress and seeking guidance on advanced techniques. His entire approach to martial arts and leadership had transformed dramatically. The government training program had been implemented, but not in the way the officials had originally envisioned. Instead of large classes focused on quick results, Chen Wei had insisted on small groups of carefully selected individuals who would then become instructors for others. The emphasis was on understanding principles rather than memorizing techniques. Li Mei, who had stayed behind to help establish the new training program, watched with satisfaction as former skeptics now practiced with the same dedication they had once reserved for more traditional military exercises. The guards were discovering that true martial arts mastery required mental discipline as much as physical skill. One morning, as Liu was leading a practice session in the courtyard, a group of visiting military officers arrived to observe the new training methods they had heard about. Word of the Royal Guard's improved performance had spread throughout the security services, generating interest in Chen Wei's teaching approach. "Captain Liu," one of the visiting officers said during a break in the training, "we've heard remarkable reports about improvements in your unit's effectiveness. Can you demonstrate some of these new techniques we've been hearing about?" Liu smiled, remembering his own eagerness to show off just a few months earlier. "The most important techniques we've learned can't really be demonstrated in a way that would be meaningful to observers. They're about internal discipline, precise timing, and understanding rather than external displays of power." The visiting officers looked skeptical, clearly expecting to see some dramatic martial arts moves like they had witnessed in movies or tournaments. "Surely there must be something concrete you can show us. Some practical applications of whatever training method you're using?" Liu considered the request carefully, then gestured toward the preserved split wooden post. "Master Chen taught us that the most impressive demonstrations often teach the least important lessons. True martial arts effectiveness comes from years of patient practice, not from individual moments of dramatic action." He picked up one of the practice swords and moved through a series of forms that looked deceptively simple to the untrained eye. His movements were smooth, precise, and completely relaxed, without any of the tension or aggression that had characterized his earlier fighting style. To most observers, it would have appeared almost boring compared to his previous flashy techniques. "The difference," Liu explained as he completed the sequence, "is that every movement now has purpose and efficiency. Before Master Chen's visit, I was focused on looking powerful and intimidating. Now I'm focused on being effective and controlled. The results speak for themselves in actual situations, even if they're not as entertaining to watch." One of Chen Wei's former students, who had remained at the palace to help with ongoing training, approached the group. Master Chen always said that the most advanced martial arts techniques should look effortless to outside observers. If a technique requires dramatic preparation or obvious strain, it probably isn't being performed correctly. The visiting officers seemed disappointed by the lack of spectacular demonstrations, but several of the palace guards who had been training under the new system volunteered to share their experiences. They spoke about improved focus, better decision-making under pressure, and increased confidence in difficult situations. As the day progressed, it became clear that the real impact of Chen Wei's teaching wasn't in any single technique or demonstration, but in a fundamental shift in how the guards approached their duties and their personal development. They had learned to value substance over appearance, patience over aggression, and wisdom over mere strength. That evening, Captain Liu sat alone in the garden where he had first spoken privately with Chen Wei months earlier. He pulled out his phone and composed a message to his teacher, updating him on the day's events and the progress of the training program. "Master Chen," he wrote, "today I realized that the most important lesson from your visit wasn't about martial arts techniques at all. It was about the kind of person I want to become and the kind of leader I want to be. The wooden post was just the beginning of understanding what real strength looks like." Miles away, Chen Wei read the message and smiled quietly. He had received similar notes from former students around the world. each discovering in their own way that martial arts mastery was ultimately about personal growth rather than fighting ability. The confrontation at the palace had served its purpose, creating an opportunity for genuine learning and transformation. The split wooden post remained in the palace courtyard for years afterward, serving as a reminder to new trainees that true martial arts mastery often appears simple on the surface, while requiring tremendous depth of understanding and years of dedicated practice to achieve. The story of that remarkable day continued to be told throughout the martial arts community, inspiring both teachers and students to look beyond flashy techniques toward the deeper principles that make martial arts truly effective.